this summer. Taylor has a connection with Cisco and brought the idea to me that we would give the first set to Cisco to do his book reading. Cisco Bradley, I'm just going to tell you what I know about him, and you correct me if I'm wrong. He's a jazz blogger, he's a journalist, he's an author. He has 2 books that I know of. One about William Parker, and this book about the improvised jazz scene in Williamsburg, Brooklyn during the 90s. He's an enthusiast, obviously a voracious listener. Maybe he's a critic, I don't know. But he's an enthusiast and a supporter of the music, clearly. So he's got this great book out right now, documenting a scene in Brooklyn of improvised music. My understanding is that it does dovetail a little bit on communities and scenes and improvised musicians coming together and things happening. And it got me thinking about what we're doing here at 0.01%, right? I desperately wish I had an anniversary date, but I don't remember when the first game was. I do not remember. But I do know that 0.01% was sort of my play on words from the Occupy Wall Street period when they were talking about the 1%, right? So I traced it back. That means we're going 10, 11 years now that we've been doing this series of improvised music in Boston. Obviously, it's a vehicle for me to have a set every month, which is great, and Pandalise, but obviously a community of musicians that we have been building over the past decade, right? We're playing a lot of stuff you guys have seen a lot of. So I thought that was cool to think about that, and Cisco's going to talk about what was happening in Williamsburg. Cisco Bradley. Oh, I'm sorry. Taylor's going to maybe join Cisco as in part of his presentation. Taylor Bynum, trumpet player, fantastic, friend of mine for 20 years. We have a couple CDs from way back when.
25, dude. Come on.
25. Cisco and Taylor may talk a little bit in regards to it. Taylor's going to play some solo material, and then we're going to do a quartet after, for the second set with one of my favorite local bass players, Brittany Carlson, and Taylor and myself, and Magdalena Obrigo, who I had not met and was going to join us, and I was very looking forward to it, couldn't make it at the last minute. And Taylor had a friend, Ian, what's his last name?
Ayers.
Ian Ayers, who on the last minute, man, joined the set. So I'm really looking forward to that too. He's a great guitar player, and so that'll be the second set. Okay, that's it. Cisco. Thanks, guys.
Woo! You're gonna sit while I listen. I'm gonna listen to you.
So, am I close to the mic? Is that good? Okay. So it's great to be here. I've admired the Lilypad for many years. It's actually my first time being here, but I've endlessly looked at concert listings and things that have been events that have been happening here for a long time. So it's really great to be here. It's great to see all of you here. Thought I would just start by talking a little bit about. I think Eric's introduction was fantastic. I moved to New York in 2000, and then a little while after that I left, went to grad school, and then ended up getting a job teaching at the Pratt Institute in 2011. So I moved back to New York at that time, and in between that, and actually before all of that, I'm originally from Wisconsin, and I got into this music while I was there, even though there wasn't a lot happening necessarily in Wisconsin. Some things were certainly happening, but I would venture down to Chicago and kind of dip into that scene, and that was really my first experience hearing a lot of this kind of music live. So anyway, moving to New York in 2011 really was a transformational experience. To me, the musicians I've been listening to for quite a few years on record, to me I consider them all celebrities, and I loved these bodies of work, and then to get to go to New York and spend time hearing people play live. I think when I first got there, I was going to about 4 concerts a week. I don't quite do that anymore, but just sort of binging on as much music as I could, and thankful for having that experience. To me, it was really, not only just to absorb all that music, but to get to know many of the musicians. And so, around 2013, I began trying to work on a book about the New York music scene, the one that I was witnessing. And from the beginning, I wanted to try to talk about how the music scene had kind of emerged in Brooklyn, in particular. I think we've all heard, sort of Manhattan's, obviously central to so much of what's happened in New York for the last, century, several centuries probably. So, but I sort of had become aware of this shift to Brooklyn, really brought on by gentrification in Manhattan. So, I just dove into that and began interviewing people. And if I had known, at the beginning how many people I'd be interviewing to try to write a book about it, I probably would have thought that was crazy. I think I ended up doing 182 interviews. I think the first one's in it was either 2012 or maybe it was 2012 to 2013, and the last one I think in 2020. So over a long span, and trying to capture a sense of what had happened in Brooklyn, what was so special about it. And of course, much of the story is artists kind of running away from gentrification or challenging gentrification. As Brooklyn went from, say, in 1988, where the book begins, basically, Brooklyn, people could occupy abandoned warehouses for free or for very cheaply, and build artist lofts and create venues, and all that kind of stuff was possible in the 80s and 90s. And then, after the turn of the millennium onwards, things got sort of increasingly difficult. If you can imagine, getting 10,000 square feet of space for under $1,000 a month, like in the early 90s, that was possible. Now, Williamsburg, you could maybe get a studio apartment for, $5,000 or something. It's completely changed. So, so the book really looks at music kind of in this environment, from an abandoned, somewhat abandoned part of New York City to being one of the so-called hippest and most desired neighborhoods in the city. So and a place that really it's no longer possible not only for artists to live, but for artists to present music. There's just there's very few venues there that have survived through the years. Writing this book, I thought it was very haunting to walk around the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, and I'd created a map of all of the venues that I was studying and trying to piece together with this book, and realizing not only are none of them there, but almost none of the buildings are even there. Most of them have been taken out and replaced with luxury condos. So I know this isn't just a story about Brooklyn. There's this is happening in a lot of places. So anyway, so that's in a way how I kind of frame the book, and the spoiler that I can give when I give these talks is that I spend about 300 pages talking about different venues, everything from artist lofts to warehouses to clubs and bars and so forth, and art galleries, but at the end of it, I say, believe it or not, most of the performances that I talk about in the book were technically illegal, because so many of them were done in unlicensed venues, or where things like alcohol might have been sold off the books, or venues that just didn't have any license to have the numbers of people they were having there, and all that sorts of things. So so I think the book in a way is also a commentary on sort of the lack of support for the arts in this country. especially on the grassroots level where I think it's most important. I think we do have venues that that get public support and so forth, and that's great. I think we also need spaces for artists to be creating, especially at the beginnings of their careers. I think a lot of people that came to Brooklyn were trying to do that at the time. So the book picks up in the late '80s, and it basically ends around 2014 with one of the some of the last DIY and sort of artist-run spaces at that time. So I cover a lot of ground in the book. I think I'm going to jump into the third chapter where I talk about primarily a wave of students that came from Wesleyan University.
Eric went to Wesleyan too, actually.
Okay. I think I did. By the turn of the millennium, Bedford Avenue between South 6th and North 9th Streets had become the social center of the Bohemian arts community in Williamsburg. Whereas at the beginning of the 1990s, a majority of storefronts along the avenue were boarded up, small galleries had given way to cafes, bookstores, and small grocery stores amid Polish delis, pawn shops, a Salvation Army outlet, and family-run pharmacies. Many commercially zoned storefronts that had served as makeshift residences over the previous decade were now being converted into retail stores, restaurants, and bookstores, especially on Grand Street, Bedford Avenue, and North 6th Street. One resident recalled suddenly feeling as if one could stay in the neighborhood on a Friday night to socialize because there were places to go, whereas there had only been a couple of bars in the entire North Side in earlier years. Musicians and artists lived throughout the neighborhood, throughout the neighboring blocks and lofts and rundown apartments. The Bedford Avenue L train stop at North 7th Street became synonymous with the art scene at the time, still bringing people from the Lower East Side and other parts of Manhattan. It also set the foundation for the North Brooklyn arts community to be interconnected along the post-industrial L train corridor, eventually spreading and moving into East Williamsburg and Bushwick, with an offshoot eventually appearing along the M train line in Ridgewood, Queens in the late 2010s. At the dawn of the new millennium, a new community began to form that would grow and evolve the music scene in new directions and in new spaces. In some ways, they were a different socioeconomic class of musicians, private university-trained musicians who had studied with some of the highest profile figures in the music. As a whole, this wave of musicians benefited from the support of foundation grants more than any group that had operated in Williamsburg before that time. The emphasis on creative composition, a hallmark of many of these figures, allowed practitioners to draw financial support aimed at European classical music at times, which did not exist in the same amounts for improvised or experimental music. In other words, the experiments of this new wave were more successfully legitimized by connecting them to a musical lineage that was institutionally recognized than those musicians operated in earlier phases of the Williamsburg scene. I should say, the Williamsburg scene basically began kind of as a punk movement, kind of evolved in the 90s into I would say primarily a noise kind of aesthetic, and then after 2000, we really see kind of the upturn of a lot of improvised music and creative composition. This wave also began the geographical scattering of the community of musicians, even if Williamsburg remained the epicenter of activity. Some musicians began to live in areas removed from Williamsburg proper, moving down the G train line into Fort Greene and adjoining parts of Clinton Hill and Bedford-Stuyvesant, an area that had extensive history as a black cultural center, having been home to a wide range of artists and entertainers in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, ranging from filmmaker Spike Lee and saxophonist Branford Marsalis to comedians Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. This transformation of the music scene brought a heavy influence that could only have been born in music schools in some ways, making its imprint on the character, purpose, and substance of the music. Creative music that wedded the improvisation of jazz and the compositional structures of classical music, as well as many other, sometimes international influences, became the new vogue. It was not that it had never happened before, but the approach increasingly became the lingua franca of the avant-garde. And in this chapter, I do talk a lot about Anthony Braxton as a major figure in Wesleyan. But I'm going to jump into talking about a few of the artists. One of Bedford Avenue's many emerging art galleries, the Sideshow Gallery occasionally booked music to coincide with art openings and other events. And I'm going to talk about another Boston originating musician. One particularly propitious encounter took place there on October 30th, 2002, when guitarist Mary Halverson and violist Jessica Bradley played their first concert as a duo in the space. Trumpeter Peter Evans, who happened to meet Halverson at a weekend jazz program when they were both teenagers, remarked how certain key elements of her distinct sound had formed fairly early. She would play these very pretty voicings and melodies, but her solos were really twisted and angular, with huge interval leaps and jagged rhythms. After having met the previous summer, Halverson and Pavone had developed an instant connection and had been rehearsing several times a week for several months. They would meet informally, each bringing a composition, make dinner, and then practice the two pieces. In the beginning, the songs were usually short instrumental pieces, but they began to lengthen and evolve as they added vocals, and sometimes laced with humor or irony. Pavone observed of their duo, "The music in some ways feels like the closest thing I have to a diary." The concert at the Sideshow Gallery did not garner a significant audience. Pavone happened to record the session on a room mic, revealing that though their ideas were not yet refined, the buds of many of their ideas were present, ready to bloom. It was the beginning of one of the 2000s most prolific and innovative duos, which over the following 10 years would evolve and grow, putting out 4 highly praised records. Their music was a searching, sometimes almost meditative exploration that drew the audience into their intimate improvisations and compositions. Soon after, Halverson and Pavone began making their way through the Brooklyn scene in a series of concerts at the Poorhouse, the Reed Cafe, Barbez, and the Right Bank Cafe, where they workshopped their material, some of which would eventually appear on their debut record, Prairies. Pavone later stated, "I didn't think about it much back then, but looking back, we were almost always the only women on most of those bills. It was a very male scene, but we made our music and were proactive in making opportunities for ourselves since they didn't come easily." By September 2003, they were prepared to present their music at Tonic, which of course is in Manhattan, which had inherited much of the knitting factory scene since the latter had closed the previous year and now was the premier stage for the New York Avant-Garde. Critic Kurt Gottschalk characterized their music as string puzzles, variations on cats, cradles, and owls' eyes that are curious and delicate. The short tracks precisely played are reminiscent of Webern, instrumental lines that suggest larger worlds without elaborating or even repeating. A couple of vocal tracks add to the feeling of peeking in on something, glimpses of very personal musics. What to Halverson and Pavone might seem like prairies come off to the listener as teeny patches of grass in forests unseen for the trees. Fellow guitarist Elliot Sharp, meanwhile, detected a kind of daring aesthetic fused with an intense, studied approach in their music and composition. Critic Peter Margisak noted that the difficulty in categorizing the work of the duo, while noting their jagged counterpoint, extended harmony, dynamics that dissolve notions of foreground and background, composition and improvisation. Pianist Matthew Shipp, who recorded them for the Blue series, which he managed for the Thirsty Ear label a few years later, wrote, "The way the music is shaped is unpredictable, but sounds familiar, even though it would be hard put to figure out who or why there is a familiarity to it, and it is beautiful. They push the envelope, but are not afraid to just be musical, and that is what is called for." Fittingly, Halverson and Pavone describe their music as the American prairie sound rebuilt with modernity. Halverson, in describing her process, wrote of instrumental techniques that she enjoyed: repetition, the balance between symmetry and asymmetry, familiar and unfamiliar, direct and circumvented, and the absurd and the nonsensical. The early concerts and release of Prairies allowed Halverson and Pavone to set up a tour through the southern United States and the Rust Belt in January 2006, playing at the Red Room in Baltimore, in Richmond, Church of the Covenant in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the Flicker Theater in Athens, Georgia, and a number of other venues in Atlanta and Chattanooga, Lexington, Kentucky, Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Their goal was to play in New York about once per month and to organize 2 tours per year, but opportunities opened up quickly, A tour of the Northeast and Midwest soon followed, visiting Boston, Northampton, Buffalo, Ann Arbor, Chicago, and Philadelphia in May and June. They played at the Other Half Festival at Tonic in New York in August and had their first European date at the Unlimited 20 Festival in Wels, Austria on November 10. 3 records followed in 2007 to 2012, as well as numerous domestic and international tours and festival performances. By 2008, they were playing the majority of their concerts outside of New York, and in October and November of 2009, they did a European tour that began in Brussels and then played extensively in Italy. They also performed at the Experimental Arts Festival in Athens, Georgia, in April 2010. Halverson in particular was heralded as a star on the rise, making singular breakthroughs on guitar. Both eventually began to focus on other projects. These are two of the earliest musicians that I became aware of quite a few years before I came to New York. So it was really a pleasure to kind of to explore a lot of their music. So.
It's also I have to say, it's funny to have a scene that I was a participant in a book now. So thank you for documenting it, and of course, so this will be inspired by Mary and Jessica.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks.
So, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how I got into this music. How I got into jazz is easy. I heard Eric Dolphy play, and that was it for me. I was sold on that. So, I think I spent a few years when I was first listening to jazz, thinking of jazz as a and this shows you my own limitations and knowledge at the time. I thought of it as a historic music from the past, and I was just devouring all these records from the 50s and 60s and earlier. And then at some point it dawned on me there must be something that's happening that's related to this now. And obviously the music has evolved a lot and it's acquired other influences and grown and everything. But to me, growing up somewhere where there wasn't really an active improvised music scene, for me it was just, it wasn't really accessible. I just didn't know about it, didn't know how it exists, where it might exist. And so I went down to Chicago and I went to the Jazz Record Mart. It's an incredible jazz record store. One of the most incredible jazz record stores I've ever been to in my life. And sort of flipping through, looking at different things, and I'd gotten that big Penguin Guide to Jazz Recordings. It was the 9th edition, and I had been gradually listening to people, looking for clips online, and I was going alphabetically through it, and I came across Taylor Bynum in that guide, and I was like, I should check out his records. So I went at that Jazz Record Mart. I got a copy of The Middle Picture, which is still a record that speaks to me, and that record is the record that kind of got me, I think, kind of introduced me to a lot of what was happening, not only in New York but in many other places. And then I was just blown away, and then I began not only looking for every other record that Taylor had ever played on, but then I started looking at all these other musicians. That's actually how I encountered Mary Halverson, that's how I encountered Jessica Levone, and on and on. So, that record was really, really special to me, and it's just a really incredible honor to share a stage with Taylor here. So, I want to read a little bit about a short section. I don't want to put Taylor too much on the spot, but I want to read a short section from the book, from a longer section that I wrote about his work.
I'm just very pleased that one of the 3 people that bought The Middle Picture took such strong inspiration from it, so I'm very happy.
So there's, this comes from a longer section, but I wanted to pull out one particular performance. It actually doesn't occur in Williamsburg, but we can break the rules on that. I wanted to read a description of a performance that Taylor led at Issue Project Room on September 28, 2006. This whole thing, I wish I had been there, but it's just, to me, it just fascinated me, everything that was going on. So I'll try to read this and explain a little bit. Back in Brooklyn in 2006, I guess I've been talking about his other work here. Even before the first record had been released, which I think we're talking about The Middle Picture there, Bynum was already working on new material. He unveiled his work on September 28 of that year at Issue Project Room on a shared evening with choreographer Rachel Bernstein. Alto saxophonist Lauren Dempster had been added to the lineup, making the band, at least temporarily, a septet. The focus on the evening was a suite titled Why Explicities? Yes. The piece was written so that it featured material in duo, trio, quartet, quintet, sextet, and septet formations. Drawing from compositional techniques engineered by Anthony Braxton and Charles Ives, Bynum created the piece to function in a modular fashion in which multiple ensembles existed alongside one another within the same piece. He managed to produce different complexities through the juxtaposition of different melodies and ensembles, or rather, creating complexity through the layering of simple materials as opposed to creating complex material through linear complex form. I think I'm quoting you there, but I don't. Issue Project Room at that time existed in an old circular silo space along the Gowanus Canal. And then there's this sort of post-industrial landscape is really the setting for so much that happened in Brooklyn. Anyway, so that space had the audience situated at the center. Think about that. So Bynum had his band move around and within the audience, choreographed to physically form duos, trios, and so forth along the different sides of the room. Bynum described the process, quote, "There might be a duo happening on one side of the circle while there was a trio on the other side, with one musician moving from one group to the other. For each ensemble that formed, there were two parts, one simple and one complex. The capitalization of X and Y in the suite title also revealed that Bynum was thinking about space and movement on an axis. C and S stood for complex and simple. Bynum was able to draw from his trio work with Mary Halverson and Tomo Fujiwara as base material for some of the compositions, and then elaborate on them with the larger group. On a compositional level, this suite introduced structural ideas that he explored further in some of his later work. By February 2008, and another album that I love is Navigation. I love that record. So anyway, putting out a plug for Navigation. By February 2008, with a great number of performances and tours under his belt, Bynum took the band back to the studio to record. Again, Bynum gave considerable thought on how to round out his second record. He bracketed the sextet suite with trio tunes, and then in turn bookended each of those with a solo improvisation. So the overall structure of the record reflected much of his thinking on sonic geometry and compositional layers. With the record finished, he approached Werner Uhlinger at Hot Hut Records, hoping that the Switzerland-based label would give the band more visibility across the Atlantic. After its release, Bynum began getting gigs in Europe as a leader for the first time and brought the band there to tour.
I hadn't thought about that gig for a really long time. Thanks, man.
I love how expressive your work is. I feel like you make me want to cry and laugh in the same piece.
Oh, stop.
So, anyway, thank you, Taylor.
Well, very thank you.
So I thought we could maybe just kind of slide into having a conversation a little bit, and I think we'd love also to take some questions from the audience as we go. So the book is the Williamsburg Avant-Garde, Experimental Music and Sound on the Brooklyn Waterfront. I'm selling them for $30. I also wrote a biography of William Parker, the great bass player. If you want both books, that I can give you them both for $50. So anyway, that's the only plug I'm going to do for the book.
You gotta get your road traps together. Merch is a whole part of the road gig. So I've known Cisco for a long time, and it's kind of fun to have someone who's a very vibrant part of the community write a book about the community. As Eric mentioned, Cisco started. I mean, it was interesting. I feel like Cisco's one of those folks who sort of fell in love with the music, and then came to the musicians and said, "What can I do to help?" Which is always a lovely thing. And I would say many of the folks in this room are similar. I think this is a music that often comes from a community and needs a community to make it happen, because as Cisco mentioned, many of its happenstances are outside of the standard economy, even the standard arts nonprofit economy. And so it often is like DIY spaces, people making stuff happen. So Cisco was like, what can I do to support the music? And a lot of musicians were like, well, we always need more places to play. We always need more people to write about the music. And so he started a blog and a concert series.
Are we actually part of an economy?
I know, exactly. A gift economy, I would say. An economy of love and spiritual pursuit. But I also really appreciate that you're explicit in that. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about the scene you talk about, and I wonder if you could outline this a little more, and I don't mean to say this self-incriminatingly, but it is true that that I went to Wesleyan where I first got to work with Braxton, and that was sort of a life changer to me, as did Eric, as a matter of fact, and both of us had similar mentors in that space, and so many people of that scene came from that. It's also a real change, because I think historically, as you're talking about the historical movements of this music, often regional identities were really from those predominantly black communities within those regions, whether it's the Detroit sound or the Boston sound, or all these different that came up within the music's development. This is in some ways the first generation that emerged after the institutionalization and the academization of it. How do you see that changing its relationship to geography, and how do you see that represented in the scene you talk about? And do you think the this is the big question that I ask myself literally on a daily basis, and is it a good thing for the music to have been institutionalized in that way?
Those are difficult questions. Yeah, I think the institutionalization has mixed together those regionalisms to a much greater degree. So I think which in some ways I think is a pity, because I think it's great. I think it's beautiful to have those regional things. You go to Detroit and you hear something distinctly different than when you're in Chicago versus LA versus St. Louis versus New York versus Boston or wherever. But I think I think the institutionalization, it gave a certain generation of predominantly black musicians an opportunity to work in the academy, which, that was an important, I think that was an important development. I think it also showcased their work in ways that, and I think it was taken seriously in ways that it might not have been otherwise. If we're being honest about kind of how the genius of black art is often, I think, downplayed in American society. So, if we're having a real conversation about that, you ask me the tough question, I'll try to give a real answer. I think, there's some, I definitely had conversations with a lot of musicians, and some of which whom have touched on this. I think about this a lot. I wrote a book about William Parker, incredible musician, community leader, and so forth, advocator for artists. And he's not predominantly seen as a teacher, but he's taught at the New School and a number of other institutions. But he said in those environments, he's never once had a black student work with him. So I think, I think it sets up other kinds of dynamics, which, you can ask, I suppose, on some level, how is the music continuing to survive? Who is it continuing to survive for? Who has access to it? Who's practicing and who is furthering it? So I think those are all things to think about. I think if we're going to have that conversation, is it a good thing? That's probably the hardest part of the whole question, I guess. I think with the collapse of the club network nationwide in the late 60s, 70s, the music had to go somewhere. So, where was it going to go? And I think, some people made it into institutions. And I think that was a very important development for the music. Could it have happened another way? Perhaps. Were there other options? Maybe. Could this country do more to support artists?
That's an easy one.
Another spoiler. The book ends with a 10-page rant about that exact thing. Where I think I spent 10 years writing this book, and I thought a lot about music. And music is this country's greatest art form. I think it's the greatest gift we've given to the world. And I'm always pleased when I travel internationally and people think of America as a place that a lot of music came from, as opposed to plenty of other things we could be known for that are maybe less good. So, the economy, we're talking about the economy. This book is a lot about the economy. I never thought I was going to get into kind of thinking about the economics, but inevitably I did, because I was constantly talking to musicians about how they survived New York. New York in 1988, when the book starts, it was sort of, there were ample opportunities in a way. People weren't necessarily making any money, but they weren't paying money out on the same level. By 2005, you have skyrocketing rents, all that kind of stuff happening. I think that's, I think it shows that these artistic neighborhoods are short-lived, and the economics of sort of late capitalism and just incredible inequalities of wealth. If we're going to get into economy, that's what spurs gentrification primarily. So people working in finance would have never thought of moving to Williamsburg in 1995. They didn't want to go there. 10 years later, it was the place to go. And what are we going to do to make sure that? One of the end conclusions that I kind of draw is that I feel like gentrification is impacting our ability to produce culture in the United States. we think about this as a sort of a social process. Beyond the genius of people who are creating, how are we going to project their work out into society if venues are being gentrified out, if artists are having to live further and further outside of urban centers, and all that is happening. So, I've strayed from that initial thread, but I think, I appreciate the question, and I think it's really important to be thinking about these things, because I think if I can sum up an answer to this issue of institutions, I think it's honestly mixed in terms of the outcomes. In terms of the racial dynamics of creative music and jazz, the legacy of jazz and all of that, improvised music and so forth. Since the 80s, I'd say, at the beginning of the 80s, the music was, the main practitioners of the music, the vast majority were of African descent. By, 2000, I would say that's no longer the case. So, what impact has that had? Is there a certain level of exploitation happening throughout that process? I would say yes, and we can. I think it's very complex, and how that's played out. So I think it's always incredibly important to recognize the roots of the genius that brought this into being. Should I ask you a difficult question?
Sure. I will take any or easy questions from the audience too. But yeah, take it. Give you a difficult question.
I'm curious, because I always had the sense. I know you participate. I think of you as a central figure in that sort of mid 2000s period in New York. In this scene. But I noticed. I feel like you also didn't completely embed yourself in that. Is my sense. I felt like for one, you didn't live in Williamsburg. You lived in other places, and I've noticed. I've always observed that you've had, you've always wanted to maintain your Boston roots, connections. New Haven for many years, and so forth. And I'd just be kind of curious to hear about your relationship with that community and how why you felt like I don't know, put words in your mouth, but sort of why you felt you needed to maintain some independence at the same time. I don't know, if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting too. I think it's what I like is that by using geography as an organizing principle, you were able to bring together a lot of very disparate musicians under one book. Because I wouldn't say, I don't know if there is an aesthetic. There's certainly, I wouldn't expect there to be an aesthetic consistency about the artists you talk about. It's really about almost
brief moments.
Yeah, brief moments and obvious synergies, and there's connections. I always joke when people ask me what I do that I describe myself as a weird jazz musician, in the sense it's faster than talking about I pursue improvised creative music involving a variety of compositional technique and no, stop. So I used to say weird jazz because I say it makes it because it's more likely that I'll collaborate with a weird rock musician or a weird classical musician or a weird hip hop musician or a weird folk musician than I will a normal jazz musician in some ways. So there's sort of that attraction in being on the fringes and I think in some ways this scene represented that at large. There's often people coming from all of these different scenes. I also feel probably because I think my musical, coming of age really was in Boston more than New York, was really being here sort of in my early mid-20s, working with Eric, working with other friends around here. Boston had a really interesting scene in the late, the next book should be the Cambridge JP Avant-Garde, 1994 to 2005 or something, or whatever, there was
Writing that down, Cisco?
Yeah, exactly. But so I think there's something interesting about, so I think I maintained some roots here, so that was a part of it, so I think I didn't buy into the New York as the end all and be all as is often presented. I also just really like trees and being I feel I take a huge amount of my personal artistic inspiration from being outside And it's very hard to do that in New York. And so even though I lived in Red Hook, which was as sort of unencumbered a neighborhood as I could be in that era, I really like trees and plants and walks and wandering around, and I feel it's hard for me. I felt I needed to have that be more regular in my life to maintain the creativity I wanted. I was feeling trapped in New York for a while. So I think, and so I moved. That's also living in New Haven changes it, and then now living in Vermont changes it even more. But so part of it is geographical, and part of it is just, I think at a certain point I was prioritizing things other than, that's for better or for worse. Not I don't mean that in a pejorative way in any way, but just, yeah, I think. But I also feel I was very lucky to be in, like I do agree with that, like, there was a particularly vibrant moment there, and I feel very lucky to have been able to participate in it, and I don't think I wouldn't make the music I make now had I not been there and had those peers and had that community and had that energy. But I also, I think it's an interesting question now because it's getting harder to find those kind of spaces because it's so much harder to economically figure out a way for a significant number of artists to be in regular communication with each other. Because that was one of the reasons I ended up moving, because even though I think there were areas that were sort of centralized, but I remember like when I lived in JP, like Eric lived down the street, Timo lived down the other street, Hobbs lived down that way. Like I walked to all my rehearsals, and that was kind of amazing. Almost could do that in New York for a little bit when a lot of folks were kind of structured around that area, but by the time I left, I mean, in my own band, I had one person who's living in Fort Greene, one person who's living in Washington Heights, one person who's living in Jersey City. So I was like, I was living in Red Hook, so you might as well live in New Haven. You know what I mean? I mean, it started to feel like the synergy, the energy that can happen geographically was already dispersing. And without that, if you don't have that, if you don't have like cool places to play, cool people to play with, like New York's a tough place to keep living in if you really like trees, and you don't live near the park. So I think that was part of it. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, so first I just wanted to say I think every music scene should be documented. I think a book should be written about Boston's scene. I think I mean we could rattle off a long list of cities I think that have had made incredible contributions to this music overall. So. So yeah, someone should write that book. I think when I hear descriptions of many of them, like the really vibrant moments in particular scenes, like the Lower East Side in the 70s and 80s, for example, like everyone lived within walking distance, and So I think there is something like that strong community connection, and I think Williamsburg had that for a moment. Though it began to kind of break, a bit. I think in that period that you were probably there, it was just like. The rents were going up, people were moving elsewhere, and anyway. Do you have one?
Why don't we take do we have
Sure.
an audience question, and then we
I was just thinking about what you were saying about like the economic motives of like these communities, and I was thinking about how I feel like as a young musician, I see like the path of being like a successful free jazz musician is to end up at like, an Ivy League or like a music school or teaching in an institution, and that's kind of like the path towards financial security. And in New York, you were mentioning how the music moved from Manhattan to Brooklyn because Manhattan's getting gentrified, and I feel like now like the communities where there is music in Brooklyn are the communities that are being gentrified, and there seems to be like when people are playing music in order to make a living or in order to be financially secure, and the intentions of like making money and making music get tied up, like I just wonder how that affects things as opposed to paradigms like, I don't know, like blues singers like in the South where they would have a completely different day job and play music as like a activity unrelated to money. And New York is this like churning machine of like economics. I just wondered like how you see that as affecting, how both of you see that as like affecting music, as when it turns into something that is kind of the same way of surviving as anything else is.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'd say there's two parts to that. First, if you find a path to free jazz success, that's an amazing thing. I mean, if that exists, right on. But I think you're right. So I remember I had an older generation friend of mine point out to me this funny, and he was like, yeah, in the 70s, like the idea was like you wanted that record label deal, like and the few labels that you knew would support the weirder music. Like everyone's trying to get the Arista deal, or trying to get the, or the German label that might give you good money to put something out. And that by sort of the aughts, 10, teens, whatever, the sort of the gold ring was like a teaching gig. And there is a worrisome aspect to that, of course. It does seem a little bit Ponzi scheme-ish if like the best job you can get is teaching other people to pursue the job that is already too rare that you have. I mean, that doesn't seem to add up at a certain point. And and I think in some ways that relates to what you were saying about gentrification and the change, and what an artist's role is I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, like what is our role inside of a larger culture? What is our role within the arts field specifically? What's our role within an academic structure? What are how can we exist within these systems that were not truly designed to support the kind of work we do? Is it best to be inside those systems and trying to reform them in a way that makes them more interesting or equitable? Is it best to prove that we can work outside of them and create alternative models? I don't know that answer yet. I've tried on both sides and both have the pros and cons. I do think finding solidarity past one's own, it's interesting. I had a friend who was a housing advocate in New York who had started as an artist housing advocate and then actually very quickly came to the realization that artists are in this unique position where they are sort of culturally elite and economically working class. And in that role need to be advocating not for artist housing, but like low-income housing writ large, and have a role to be part of the community. If they are coming into communities because of affordable rent and affordable space where you can build something and make concerts happen, you actually really have a responsibility to connect and support that community and not act as a gentrifying force and figure out how you can do that. You have access to cultural avenues that other members of that neighborhood might not. You might have different hours, so you're available to advocate during the day, or contact your city assembly person or something, where somebody working a 9 to 5 might not. You have a way to sort of bring some attention to it. So it is trying to use that role, acknowledge that role, as opposed to, I think too often we sort of pretend that we're one or the other, and I think there's actually something kind of interesting about the artist role being that in-between trickster role, being that in-between sort of trying to make those connections. And so I think there's a role that I just can't, and I don't know, it goes back and forth though. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I think we all are, and that's kind of what we try to do. But I do think it's important to consider how the ethics or morals or practices of one's artistic practice should model how the choices you're making in life. And I honestly very much on a very regular basis struggle with, as I've had some amazing students, and I have, I don't mean that just because I have some folks I know that have studied with me here, but I've been very lucky to have that, and that keeps me going. I also recognize the hypocrisy of me teaching this music in an elite obscenely endowed and elite institution on a daily basis, and I don't know if I made the right choice, but at least we have to think about it and challenge it and keep nudging it, and I think that's what we try to do creatively as well as what we do in our sort of day-to-day life. So just as long as we keep calling ourselves to, it doesn't mean we're always going to make the right decision, doesn't mean decisions are always easy, but call ourselves to account as with the same level of critical consciousness in our life choices as we do in our art. And I think too often we, as artists, and I say this very much mea culpa too, is almost reserve our difficult choices for our art, and then that allows that we sort of let ourselves go for our life choices, and I think we have it's a challenge to try to not do that. I don't know if that helped or made any sense or answered the question or has to do with the book or has to do with music, but thanks for asking.
That strikes me as an honest answer.
Yeah.
I think I was sitting here thinking, do I know any free jazz musicians who make their living playing music, predominantly? And I think I may know one or two, but I think if there's circumstances being very special, and I think one of the people I'm thinking about has lived in the same apartment, same rent controlled apartment since 1970 in New York, something, like some sort of special circumstance like that. But the economy of it is I think this country should get its act together and support its artists. And there's a lot of, I think, different models that we could think through on that on a societal level.
I'm sorry, can I just jump in real quick there?
Sure, John.
I agree, I totally agree, but I actually think it's interesting, like during the pandemic, I was making the argument that the single best thing that happened to support artists was expanding unemployment for freelancers, which was never the case before.
Totally.
And I think it's almost like, I would almost argue that the single best thing this country could do for artists would be like a universal basic income or universal health insurance, or things that actually serve, I know exactly, it's laughable, but like things that actually allow I think it's important to put the needs of artists within the context of the needs of the greater culture, because I think when it gets removed from that and we're prioritizing artists' needs above those of the larger culture, that's when it gets dangerous. And I think that's, anyways. We can make some music.
Yeah. I'm gonna interrupt because I can.
Please, let's make some music. We talked too long. We're supposed to be done by 8:30.
There's no segment.
Sorry.
There's a couple of people who also have questions.
Okay.
We also want to play some music.
Yeah.
So let's just be aware of the time.
Okay.
Or we can.
But I think this is totally cool. I'm not shutting it down.
I'm
Moving along. I think there's some questions.
Okay, we'll be quick in our answers.
Yes.
Yeah.
I won't even ask, I'll just make a statement, not a question. Someone asked Joe Henderson once, do you have a full-time job? And he said, yeah, I practice 8 hours a day. So that dovetails to like talking about.
Or the other line, I think I've heard it attributed to like 10,000 different musicians. It's like, no, I play for free. I get paid to travel. And that's, but yeah.
Well, it seems like there's a big disparity between the seriousness that so many artists put into this kind of work and the way that I think our society generally views music and the arts, which is.
I have to dovetail into one other quick thing though. Back in the late 70s, you got to also put in perspective all of the other art forms. Look back in the 60s, how many actual, what was the painting scene like in America? And what was the music scene like in America? And all of the arts, there were so many less artists back in the 60s and 70s. You could count jazz musicians on 2 hands. They all went to Rindia Studio, and like the whole scene was so much smaller now. I would say proportionally now in the last 30 years, and I'm not just talking about jazz, I'm talking about filmmaking, especially filmmaking, visual art has exponentially, because there's like 1,000 more schools, so there's so many more people doing it now.
No, so that's a really good point.
And so and I would say the quality of improvisation is got a much wider range of latitude than when you went to Studio Ridley in the 70s, and everybody was top shelf usually.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole architecture of cultural music, in music and in painting and in filmmaking has radically changed in the last 30 years.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Yeah,
sort of a statement,
yeah. But then there's also the thing that we think about, that in some ways in a utopic society there are no artists because we're all making our art, So it's hard to figure out.
Utopias don't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
So
but do we lean into the specialities? Yeah, no, exactly. So it's an interesting. Yeah.
Your instrument is very loud, but you're playing softly tonight. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm wondering about in the book is like busking culture. Like,
Oh, that's a great question.
How loud can you be, and like who controls that? You know what I mean?
That's a great question.
If you went in front of like the chess tables at Harvard Square, like how loud could you play?
That's a really good question. And I actually think that's interesting a lot. The role of sort of public performance. I do a lot of outdoor playing because that's where I'm happiest playing, honestly, a lot of the time, but often not for an audience, just because I like playing outdoors. Because it's interesting, actually, for me, I was reminded of that trying to play solo in front of all of y'all. Y'all are wonderful, welcoming people, but I'm used to playing solo like completely by myself, like on a rock on the side of a mountain, like a couple miles from my house, which and it's interesting because I think in that context, it's so easy to get outside of one's head and have so much to respond to. And that's one of the things I always loved about busking or playing outside in contexts like that, whether or not I have a hat out for money, is there's so much feedback. You're always, even if you're playing solo, you're never playing solo. There's the pace of people walking by, there's the wind, there's the weather, there's everything happening. And I think that's actually a context where you have to learn to play dynamics and I actually think it's a great place to be as an improviser, because you're forced to be, you can't control your context and you have to interact with it, and and dynamics becomes a big example of that. Like, this is an instrument that is designed to play in a certain way and in a certain role. what I love about this musical practice writ large, and that playing outside of playing in unusual contexts forces you to do, is reimagine that role. So if the trumpet's expected to be the loud, bright instrument that's on top of the orchestra and plays the dramatic melody at the end, I'm like, well, that's not going to work playing in this place because it's too reverberant, or there's too much background noise, or there's too many other beautiful noises happening. So let me work inside of that space and see what I can do with it. That's a space that I think is, and I think that, yeah, that's this place I really love being as an improviser. But the other place I love being as an improviser, to make a very natural segue, is to play with the amazing musicians that we're about to play with tonight.
Let's do that.
So let's make the segue. But again, one more hand for Cisco Bradley.
Thank you all. Great audience. Thank you, Taylor.
Nice book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in the back. I can sign copies if anybody.
So while we set up the music, go ask Cisco any additional questions and buy his book.